Uh, I hope everybody can see the screen. This is our Tisha B'Av gathering. And I just want to point out that we are making history tonight because I can never recall in all my time at Temple Emmanuel taking time to observe Tisha B'Av. And so this is our moment. This is our chance to do that. But it's not a service. It's not going to be through a service. Instead, what I'd like to do is talk about the significance of the day, traditional practices for Tisha B'Av, and then get into, since Tisha B'Av is primarily a day in which we Jews recall the destruction of the first and second temple, as you can see from the picture there on the screen, hopefully. I want to talk about the reasons given for why, by the rabbis, why the first and second temples were destroyed. And then from there, share some songs of mourning before we do some discussion. I'd like to ask your help tonight because, it's to me, it's a challenge, not only as, in a reform setting, but just in general, to come to a day of mourning for an event which happened thousands of years ago. I mean, when we think of tragic events in Jewish history, of course, I think more readily the Shoah, the Holocaust, comes to mind. And we have Yom HaShoah every year to say Kaddish for those who were murdered in the Holocaust. This is something a long, long time ago. But I want to talk about what we can make of this day in our time. And then at the very, very end, I hope time permitting, to give you a little sampling of the Book of Lamentations, which is traditionally read and chanted on Tisha B'Av. So without further ado, this is Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av. And many tragic events, it's said, occurred on this day on the Jewish calendar. Among them, if you recall from the book of Numbers, which we just read recently, the sin of the spies. Moses sends out 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan. And 10 of them come back with a fearful report of the giants who inhabit the land and saying that there's no way that the Israelites are going to be able to overtake them and enter the land. And they cause the people to go into panic mode. And so God is incensed by this. And the result is that all of the generation that came out of Egypt, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, who were the spies who said, no, God says we're going to do this, we can do it. Everyone else is destined to die in the wilderness before entering the land, that generation. Of course, as I said, this is a day on which in 586 BCE, the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, resulting in our ancestors being taken in exile to Babylonia, thankfully returning. But then in 70 CE, the second temple, after it's rebuilt, of course, the temple is rebuilt, the second temple is destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. That's the primary focus traditionally of this day. But there are other events as well that happen to occur on the 9th of Av. Among them, Betar, which was the last fortress which held out against the Romans after they laid waste to Jerusalem during the Bar Kokhba revolt, which fell in 135 CE. The massacre of the Tower of York later on, leading to the expulsion of Jews from England. And in 1492 of all times, King Ferdinand of Spain issued an expulsion decree against the Jews, which took effect on, when else? The 9th day of Av. And then later on, a little bit later on, it was the day of mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. So a lot of sad and tragic events occurred on this day on the Jewish calendar. So the rabbis of the Talmud said this is a day of mourning, or to be a day of mourning for all of us. It's similar in feel to Yom Kippur, being that we fast traditionally, wash for pleasure, or hygiene, not for pleasure, no sexual relations, no perfume colognes, and refrain from wearing leather in respect to kindness for animals. Also, those in mourning, in a house of mourning, that someone who's experienced the death of a loved one traditionally sits on low to the ground, or on a stool low to the ground. And I am sitting, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm sitting on the floor of our bima. Also, traditionally, the lights would be off, but I'm kind of scared of cockroaches and such. But I do have, I got to talk to you folks. This is where I'm at. But I do have my flashlight, okay? I do have my flashlight, which is working, okay? Uh, and I have to tell you, as a child growing up in a conservative congregation, I don't recall going to any kind of gathering for Tisha B'Av growing up. I do recall when I was in Manhattan going to B'nai Jeshurun and sitting on the floor there in their sanctuary to hear the Book of Lamentations.
Really?
So I don't really, it's not really, to my perceptions, it's not really a part of Reform Jewish practice. It's not, and that's why I want to talk to you tonight later on about what's the context for this day for us in 5780 in 2020 for something, again, that happened thousands of years ago. So other things, if you were extremely traditional in your practice of Judaism, then 3 weeks ago, you would have marked the anniversary of the Romans breaching the walls of Jerusalem and leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple. And that was a fast day as well of Tammuz. And it leads to a period called the 3 weeks, where one refrains from celebratory activities, weddings and such. And then it gets even heightened, this sense of mourning, when we get to 9 days out from today. One refrains from eating meat or drinking wine because of this heightened state of mourning and other restrictions as well. So we come to today, where again, primarily we recall the destruction of the first and second temples. And so naturally, you may be asking, well, what led to the destruction of the first and second temple? So let's start at the very beginning with the first temple, as I attempt to show off my sharing skills. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go. Okay. So I want to share a couple of biblical texts. Get rid of this guy. So this is from the book of Leviticus. Again, we read not too long ago from Vayikra chapter 18. And this is Moses addressing the Israelites in terms of behavior. And he says something very interesting when we get to verse 24. You shall not defile yourselves by any of these things being something that's considered, abhorrent, offensive to God, and not in keeping with being holy. So you shall not defile yourself by this behavior, for the nations who I'm sending away from before you have defiled themselves with these things. So don't be like the other nations. Don't be like the other peoples. Be holy, be separate. And Moses goes on to say, and the land became defiled, and I visited its sin upon it. And the land, this is a wonderful phrase, tika or taki, vomited out its inhabitants because of their behavior, their unholy behaviors. But as for you, you shall observe God's laws and ordinances, and shall not do any of the like that's an abomination, nor the stranger who sojourns with you. For the people of the land who preceded you did all these things, and the land became defiled, and let the land not vomit you, having defiled it, as it vomited out those before you. I don't mean to make anybody just feeling gross right now or nauseous, but this is. And a lot of it's great that they actually translate it as vomit, because a lot of other translations kind of clean it up a little bit, but leaves a chabad just to let it go. So there we go. So Moses is warning before the people about their behavior having consequences, and so it's a little hint that he's leaving about behavior leading to tragedy. And so I want to go to Jeremiah now, to the prophets, because he addresses this issue. Let's see, to Jeremiah 2. Yirmiyahu 2, here we go. Okay. And Jeremiah, mind you, lived through the destruction of the first temple and the exile to Babylonia. So he lived it. But God is speaking through him right now. And he says starting verse 5, so says the Lord, what wrong did your forefathers find in me, God, that they distanced themselves from me, and they went after futility and themselves became futile? And they did not say, where is God who brought us from the land of Egypt, who led us out in the desert, in a land of plains and pits, in a land of waste and darkness, in a land where no people had passed and where no people had dwelt. And I brought you to a forest land to eat of its produce and goodness, and you came and contaminated my land. So listen, I've done all this stuff for you, and what did you do in return? You didn't return in kind what I gave you, or what I did for you, or in the spirit of. And he goes on in another oratory which is called the Temple Sermon because he's standing at the entrance to the temple. And he says the following. This is again Jeremiah. Let's see, I want to get to this. And now because you committed all these acts, and says the Lord, and I spoke to you going early and speaking, but you did not hearken and didn't listen, and I called you, but you did not respond. And I will do to the house upon which my name is called, basically the Jewish people, upon which you rely, the temple rather, and to the place that I gave you and your forefathers, as I did to Shiloh, which is a town which was destroyed earlier. And I will cast you away from my presence as I cast all your brothers, all the seeds of Ephraim. So he kind of foretells what's going to happen if the people, because they didn't get their act together in terms of their musar, their behavior. And now you may ask, well, what were those behaviors? Well, let me share that with you from another source. This is from Talmud, from Yoma 9b, which lays out 3 major sins that were going on in and around the temple, first temple, at this time. So here we go. Let's see if you can see. Oh, here we go. So it says right here, due to what reason was the first temple destroyed? Talmud asked. It was destroyed due to the fact that there were 3 matters that existed in the first temple. This was going on in the first temple. Idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Not good things going on in a sacred place, the center of holiness and the community at this time. So these 3 things, the rabbis teach, led and set the conditions for the destruction of the first temple and the exile to Babylonia. One more source that I wanted to share from Talmud with you about this. Wow, my skills have really improved. Thank you, Stephanie, for helping me practice my screen sharing. They don't teach you screen sharing in rabbi school, let me tell you. They should. Here we go. Echarab, okay. Let's see, come on up, here we go. Echa, which means how. How could this happen? And that's the first word in the book of Lamentations, Echa. And it's actually referred to as the book of Echa. These are 3 who prophesied with the language of Echa. How could this happen? And they were Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. And I shared with you Moses, and I shared with you Jeremiah. Moses said, Echa, how can I carry these people on my shoulders alone? Isaiah says, how has she, Israel, become like a prostitute, unfaithful? And Jeremiah says, how does she live like this, basically? And then says Rabbi Levi, Israel is compared to a noblewoman who had 3 friends. One who saw her in tranquility and peacefulness, one who sees her in recklessness, and one who sees her in degenerateness. And this degenerateness leads to the destruction of the temple. And there's a piece of Talmud, a wonderful piece of Talmud, or interesting one I want to share it to you. It says, when the Babylonian army attacked Israel, they had their eye on destroying the most precious place for the Jewish people. On the 9th of Av, they burned down the first temple in Jerusalem. And at that tragic time, the young priests climbed up to the top of the roof of the temple, and they threw the temple keys up in the air, saying, Master of the universe, since we have not been true custodians, stewards of this holy place, we're returning the keys to you. And at that moment, a heavenly hand, as it were, comes down and takes the keys. So that's the destruction of the first temple and the reasons given for why this horrible event happened. And mind you, this was the temple. There was not a Jewish community of Kauai or Temple Emmanuel all over the place at the time. This was the temple. So I can't imagine the heartbreak of watching your holy place of gathering for your community going up in flames, or just a stone by stone coming down. So that's the first temple. I want to talk about the second temple. And the second temple, it's interesting. The first temple was destroyed with what was going on between people and God, what was going on in the temple. Notice the difference now with the second temple. The second temple was destroyed because, as the rabbis explained, because of what they call sinat chinam, baseless hatred. And so what is baseless hatred? Well, I'm going to ask Rabbi David Foreman of a wonderful organization called Aleph Beta to explain, with a very famous Talmudic story, what baseless hatred is. And so here is Rabbi Foreman, and I hope you can hear it. And here we go. Okay. Oh, I'm going to go this one. This is the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa.
The Charav Yerushalayim. It was because of the episode of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa that Jerusalem was destroyed. But the kind of event, in some essential way, which takes place here, is responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem in the eyes of the sages. What kind of event is it? Hau Gavra Derach Me Kamsa Ubal Devave Bar Kamsa. There was a fellow who had a friend by the name of Kamsa and an enemy by the name of Bar Kamsa. One day, Avad Sudasa, one day this fellow makes a great feast and invites everyone. The great sages of the time are invited. All his buddies are invited. Amarle Lashame, and he tells his servant, Zil Aisile Kamsa, among all the people on my guest list, go invite Kamsa, my friend. Azil Aisile Bar Kamsa. The servant mistakenly addressed the invitation and accidentally brought him Bar Kamsa instead. Well, Bar Kamsa was his enemy. So the feast begins. And as everyone is dining under the fine chandeliers, the Baal Simcha, the feast maker, is making his way through the guests, saying hello to everyone. And then out of the corner of his eye, Asa Ashkache de Havayasif, he sees Bar Kamsa sitting down at his feast. Amarle, he approaches him and says, Nichti, let's see, Hu Gavra Baal Devave da Hu Gavrahu. You're my enemy. My bias, what are you doing here? Kum Puk, get up and leave. Amarle. So Bar Kamsa replies, look, Holavasai, since I'm here already, Shavkan, leave me. I'll even pay you for the cost of my food and my drink here. Amarle, he responds, lo, no. So Bar Kamsa says, I'll pay for half of your whole feast. Amarle, lo, he says, no. Amarle, I'll pay for your entire feast, the whole shebang. It's on me. Just let me stay. Amarle, lo. He says no. Nakte biyade. He picks him up physically, and throws him out of his feast. Okay, so that is episode number 1. The spotlight now turns to Bar Kamsa. Amar, he says to himself, the rabbis were there. They saw all this, and they didn't protest. Shmamina kanichaluhu. Evidently, they're okay with all this. Hazel echel behu kurtsa be'malka. I'm going to get my revenge. What if I can find a way to get the Romans involved here? Of course, in this time, in the last days of the Second Temple, Rome has political and military control of Israel. And while the Jews do have self-government, they are ultimately answerable to Rome. So Azal Amalei Caesar, Mardu Bach Yehudai. So Bar Kamsa goes and he tells Caesar, the Caesar. Now the commentators say that this wasn't actually Caesar, but it was the Roman procurator in charge of Jerusalem at the time. The Jews are rebelling against you. So Amarle mi yemar. So the procurator, the general, sends back word. Who says? How do I know it's really true? Amarle. Bar Kamsa says, Shadrlu kurbana. Why don't you send an offering to their temple? Chazasi makrivin le. Why don't you see if they offer it for you or if they refuse? So Azal Shadr biyade egla tlasa. So the procurator says, good idea, and sends back with Bar Kamsa 3 calves to be offered on behalf of Rome and the Jewish temple. Bahadi de Ka'asi Shadr Benuma, as Bar Kamsa is bringing the animals to the temple, he cuts the upper lip of each of the animals. Now the reason he does that is because there is a law that an animal that's a balmum, an animal that has some sort of blemish, may not be offered in the temple. So Bar Kamsa is actually creating a blemish in each of these animals, but he's doing so very cleverly. The Romans also understood this idea of not offering animals with a blemish. They gave sacrifices to pagan gods, and they wouldn't sacrifice a blemished animal either. Bar Kamsa cleverly cut the upper lip of each of the animals. It was a kind of wound that the Romans would not consider a blemish, but Torah law would recognize it as a blemish. So the animal arrives at the temple, and the rabbinic authorities there see that these are blemished animals, but they also see that they've come from Rome. And now they have a dilemma. Savar Rabbanan lekruve mishum shlom malchus. The rabbi's initial response to blemishes, because peace with the authorities takes precedent over the technical requirements of sacrificial law. They're making a halachic judgment. Peace outweighs these concerns about whether the animal is a Baal Mum or not. And that's what they were going to do, except for an objection leveled by one fellow, a rabbi by the name of Rabbi ben Avkulus, who said, Yomru Bali Mumin Craven Lagabi Mizbeach, we can't do it. If we offer this animal, people will get the wrong idea. They'll say, blemished animals are allowed to be offered on the altar. It'll be catastrophic. We cannot allow it to happen. So the rabbis were stuck. They weren't going to offer the offering, but they understood the terrible implications of rejecting Rome's offering. So they cast about for another solution. Sober Lamigdale. They thought, maybe let's kill Bar Kamsa. We shouldn't go back to Rome and tell them, see, they've rejected your offering. Amar Lahu Rav Zcharia, but Rav Zcharia ben Avkulus, the same rabbi, said, Yomru Matal Mum B'Kodshim Yahara. We can't do that either. People get the wrong idea. People will say that someone who intentionally places a blemish in a consecrated animal is liable to the death penalty. We cannot offer the offerings, and we cannot touch Bar Kamsa. And so they rejected the offering. Bar Kamsa went back with the news of it to Rome. Years later, the Gemara records, Rav Yochanan, the great sage in Israel, who lived centuries after this, said, An v'sanuso shel Rav Zcharia ben Avkulus, hichriva es beiteinu v'sarta es echaleinu. The unwise humility of Rav Zcharia ben Avkulus is responsible for destroying our holy temple. As explained by some of the commentators, Rav Zcharia's argument was really, who are we to make such weighty decisions, to contravene the law of blemishes? People get the wrong idea. Who are we to take matters into our own hands? We didn't have broad enough shoulders to make these kinds of decisions. And it was wrong-headed humility that ended up destroying the temple. But now let's get back to the main story. What happened next after the offering of Rome was rejected? Shadar Eliyahu Nero and Caesar. Nero, the Caesar, got word of this brazen refusal by Judea to offer Rome's offerings. He came to wage a campaign against Jerusalem. Kika Asi, and as he was coming, he must have had the sense, as he approached the holy city, that he was embarking on a momentous campaign against the God of Israel. So he stopped for a moment, Shada Gira Mizrach, took an arrow out of his quiver, put it in his bow, and shot it in an eastward direction. Asa Nafal B'Yushalayim. The arrow went and fell on an exact direct line pointing toward Jerusalem. Lamarov, he shot an arrow to the west, Asa Nafal B'Yushalayim. It fell in an exact line to Jerusalem. La'arba Ruchos Hashamayim. He shot an arrow in all four directions. It landed in exactly the same place, pointing him towards Jerusalem. At that moment, he caught sight of a Jewish child wandering on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Amar Leili Yanuka, so he said to this little kid, Psokli Psukech, what have you been learning in school? Amar Le, the child said, we just happen to be studying this verse in Ezekiel, chapter 25. V'natati et nikmati be'edom b'yad ami Yisrael. God says that I will ultimately take out my vengeance on Edom, on Rome, through my people Israel. And at that point, Nero put two and two together and said to himself, I understand what's going on here. The master of the universe, the mighty God, is looking to destroy his own house. He's looking to wash his hands with that guy, me. I ain't going to be the scapegoat here. I'm not interested. Arak v'azal v'gayer. He left the campaign, went back and resigned his commission and converted to join the people of Israel. Let's just understand what happened here. Nero saw two things. The first thing that he saw was that his arrows, no matter where he shot them, ended up at Jerusalem. The second thing he saw was the child that started talking verses to him. The arrows convinced him that God was interested in destroying his own house, destroying Jerusalem, that God's anger was going to be taken out on Jerusalem. The second thing that he saw convinced him that despite the fact that God was the one who wanted to destroy Israel, Rome would be the one to pay for it. The verse the child tells him about is that the vengeance of God will be kindled against Rome. He looks at this situation and says, this isn't fair. I'm not going to take the fall for you, God. You want to destroy your own house, destroy your own house. Don't blame it on me. This man became the ancestor of Rameir. But alas, the campaign of Rome was picked up by Vespasian, and ultimately the temple was destroyed. These are the first 4 episodes in the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa.
So that's one or two theories, actually, that Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred, through the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, along with the unwise humility, as Rabbi Foreman puts it. But there's another theory, too, that this baseless hatred began, of all things, through Talmud Chachams, through students at the time, who were so believing in their positions on things, their interpretation of Torah and Talmud, that if someone didn't agree with them, it wouldn't just be, I'm right, you're wrong, but I'm right and you're a heretic. It was that severe in their criticism of the other for disagreeing. And in terms of disagreeing, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks talks about in his seven principles of peoplehood that how we disagree with each other is part of the pillars of keeping a people together. And he points out 3 instances where that led to a downfall of a people, which was the time of Joseph and his brothers, who couldn't agree on anything in a civil matter, and see what happens to Joseph, of course. The death of Solomon, whose son is heir to his throne, but who experiences a split between what was the northern, or what will become the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. And then finally, this time of the Second Temple, where this disagreeing in a very, again, unholy manner, really played into this baseless hatred and brought about the destruction. So before I turn over to you and pose some questions in how we frame and what context we use now for this day, this is a day of mourning, and there are songs of mourning that are traditionally offered. I want to just share a little excerpt of them, starting with Eli Tzion. Here we go.
Check 1, 2. Eli Tzion ve'oreo kemo ishor betzireo v'chivesu lo chakurasak al bo'al neireo Alei Amon Asher Nutash B'yashmason Atoreo Ve'al Biyas Mecharfei Kel B'soch Mikdash Chatoreo
So it says, Eli Tzion, this song of mourning, is the last in an Ashkenazic collection of keynote, of lamentations. It's traditionally sung in more of like a recitative, spoken kind of style. This is a more modern take on it. But in this, the poet says to Tzion, to Jerusalem, likening her to a woman who has suffered both destructive and redemptive pain. The pain of a young woman who is widowed, the pain of a mother who brings new life into the world. And it says, taken as a whole, the poem is a mournful call to Zion to lament her tragic destruction. Only in the last verses do we come to understand that this lamentation, this lament, is also a call to God to hear the cry of the Jewish people, To conjure this mournful call, the poet opens every stanza with ale and ends with ha, the sounds of weeping and the sounds of sighing. That's one of the songs of mourning. Another more traditional one is Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, if I forget you, Jerusalem. And this is a performance by Dudu Fisher.
Finding a change of scenery is more rewarding than you think, because whatever you're checking out, when you check into a hotel by Wyndham, you're opening the door to the world.
There's the text for you as well.
תשכח ימיני, ידבק לשוני, אוי לחיכי, אם לא אזכרכי, אם אשכחך ירושלים, תשכח ימיני, תדבק לשוני, אוי לחיכי, אם לא אזכרכי.
So that's another song of mourning that is sung on Tisha B'Av. And finally, if you were in Israel earlier today, and you went to the Kotel, to the wall, you would probably not be alone, because there'd be a large crowd gathered. And this is from past Tisha B'Av at the wall. And where do we go with it? Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay. This is a large crowd singing Ani Ma'amin. So they're singing, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. Even the Messiah tarries if the Messiah doesn't come so soon or so readily to us. So with that, let me get out of here. So I've talked about the events which occurred on this day and throughout our history. Talked about the ways that it's observed as a day of mourning. Talking about specifically the destruction of the first and second temple and the theories, the reasoning behind that, or that it's posited why those events took place. And then some of the ways that mourning happens on this day. So I wanted to make this not a spectator sport, but rather I wanted to pose 3 questions. And if other thoughts come to mind, please feel free to share them. So do you think that, how do you think that we Jews have found the will to go on time after time after tragedy after tragedy? How do we find the will to continue? Do you think we're controlled by a God of history? It talks about God wanting to destroy God's holy temple. Is that a theory that you subscribe to, or do you think we're not necessarily controlled by a God of history, that it's more just us creating the conditions for these things to happen in a sense, or just evil existing on earth? And then do you think the destruction of the first and second temples is something to be mourned by us today? Is it reason for us to mourn? So I'm going to welcome any and all comments to this while I get ready to offer some comments. Anybody have any thoughts about? And I'm sorry, with the screen sharing, it's hard for me to see people's hands. So I'm going to also rely on Stephanie a little bit too to help me out. But what do you think? How have we found the will to go on after these events, horrific events, horrific, I rather? Are we controlled by a God of history? And is the destruction of the temple something that we necessarily need to mourn today? What do you think?
I have a thought, Rabbi Ken.
Please, go right ahead.
So something that popped into my mind was what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Ah.
So these things that happen to us actually make us a stronger and stronger people throughout history. Everything that has happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
You asked about the will to go on. Well, it makes us stronger. So it makes us even more determined to make the world a better place or do whatever we have to do to continue to survive as a people.
Mm. And yes, I think there's a sense of hopefully learning from these tragedies in helping one go on. And as you said, be the stronger or wiser for it or better for it. And it's interesting that we're sitting here today about almost a little over 7 weeks out from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we're supposed to, start or be in the process, in the throes of Teshuva, of trying to turn our lives in a better direction. So, anybody else? What do you think? Do you think that this is something that God brought about, or you think that people's behaviors at the time, both within the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, brought them about? And do you think the destruction of the temple is something necessarily to be mourned? And while you're thinking about a response, some other thoughts. Of course, when I say, are we controlled by a God of history, meaning God's role in it, I think, I can't wrap my brain around the thought that, for instance, the Holocaust was in any connection to God's action. I don't accept that for a moment. I do believe that the rabbis take part in constructing history, if you will, that that tragedy, though, does sometimes come from our capacity to turn against each other within our communities. That's not necessarily something it's a good part of our community, but it just sometimes happens in communities, in Jewish communities, and sort of takes our eye off of outside threats and conditions. But at the same time, after the event, we can do Teshuva. There's a way back to a better place, a better state of living and relating to each other. And one of the things that I want to share with you from another piece of Talmud is here in Avot de Rabbi Natan, says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest rabbis who ever lived, I think, perhaps the greatest rabbi who ever lived, because during the siege of Jerusalem, or one of them, he has his students smuggle him out in a coffin with a Torah scroll so that the Torah survives, we survive. Anyway, so he's walking with Rabbi Yehoshua, follows after him, and he sees the holy temple destroyed. They see this horrible thing. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, woe to us, for this holy place is destroyed, the place where all of our sins are forgiven. What do we do? Rabbi Yochanan turns to him and says, my son, do not be distressed, because we have another form of making atonement, just like it. And what is it? He says, Gimilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. I also say prayer became our way of bringing sacrifice and bringing our the direction and intention of our hearts in seeking forgiveness, well-being, whatever we're seeking. So that came about from it. The destruction of the temple, of course, meant that it was sort of the death of a sacred space, because this was the sacred spot in the world for Jews, the temple, first and second. And in having this destroyed, it left us with sacred time, like the time of Shabbat. But with the state of Israel, and also with the diaspora, our willing exile, which we went, around the world to settle, including here in Hawaii. It sort of makes our home portable, and it revives sacred space, because I believe that I'm sitting on a sacred space right now in our bima. And I know you have a sacred space that you go to, each of you, to access connection and meaning. So today we have the state of Israel. Our exile is not involuntary, if you will. We're in the galut, in the diaspora. Also, with the temple destroyed, it meant the end of the priests, the Kohanim, offering animal sacrifices, which, as a pet owner, I don't think I wouldn't say that I miss that too much. I kind of like that we have prayer without having to take, find a calf or whatever to come and have slaughtered at the temple by the Kohanim. And also bear in mind at the time, sadly, the Kohanim were, how do I say this, a bit, there was a bit of corruption with, thank you, corrupt. And so it leaves from the corrupt Kohanim to the rabbis who are hired for their services. I like to think based on the meritocracy, that on their ability and skill. So, so what can we focus on Tisha B'Av 5780 2020? What can we be doing here tonight? What could we be focusing on, and in future years? Because I would love to have a gathering on Tisha B'Av. I want to have a meaningful one for us now. What do you think? What can we focus on? And apologies again, I can't. If you can unmute yourself if you want to respond, or chat box, or wave hands.
Rabbi Ken, I've lost my picture of everybody except you.
Oh, it's okay. I can see you fine. Yeah, please. Do you have a thought on what we can focus on today for Tisha B'Av?
I think we could focus on the mourning that we could do for people that have died in feelings of injustice, the racism and things of that sort as well. I think it would have more meaning to many people, and make a connection between the two. Because looking back at the time of the temples, people were not as educated as we are today. They didn't have the science that we have today. And we have more people straying from Jewish thoughts than we did then, because they didn't have the communication that we have, and they didn't have the kind of educations that we have. Many of the people were illiterate.
Right.
So that today, if we can make that connection from then until today, and look at the sacrifices that many people have made, and that other ethnicities have made as well, not just ours. Because if in more recent years, you could look and say, how has Black America survived all this time? How have the Hispanics survived and still want to come to this country? And so things of that sort to bring it in. By the way, my name is Roberta, and I'm from...
Roberta, yes, thank you. I can see you just fine. I'm glad. Thank you.
I can't get a picture up on this. I don't know what I did, but...
Anyone else have a thought about... thank you, Roberta. Thank you. Anybody else have a thought about what we can focus on today? So one of the things is that I think history, particularly Jewish history, helps us as a people and community survive. Both when we've been in very, how can I say, not the greatest of political climates with respect to the Jewish community in different eras, and also our own cognitive dissonance when we kind of stray from the community and come back and have, sort of not a straight line, let's say. But I think we can learn from our history. I think if we think of the metaphorical temple, because what did the temple represent? It represented solidarity. It represented safety for our community. It represented a place to go for spiritual intimacy that we all hopefully aspire to have in our Jewish community, or for us. It also, someone said, shows our capacity to thrive even under the most worst of conditions. And maybe it's because, maybe we survived also because God still needed us to go and do our task of being that light to the nations. And speaking of that, maybe it's not a mournful thing to move on from systems and institutions that don't necessarily serve us in the time now, but to still be able to remember the temple. How can I say, like you'd remember almost your first apartment in this kind of romanticized way, but something that fit you at the time, and that sinat chinam. If we take it from baseless hatred, well, what do we need to substitute for sinat chinam? We need ahavat chinam. We need baseless love, as Roberta just said, not only within the Jewish community, but with everyone, with other communities as well. And really today we have this virus, this COVID, which has made it hard to get together. It's kind of been challenging us in terms of pushing us apart, you could say. It's devastated our economy, our political insecurities, but we have the example of the resilience of the Jewish people through very, very difficult times. And so I hope that we can take that with us right now and maybe take away that from today.
I'd hate to steal.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'd hate to steal the idea of Hanukkah rededication.
Yeah.
But these horrendous events,
mm-hmm.
destruction of the temple,
right,
took us from safe moorings, being an isolated holy people,
mm-hmm.
And turned us loose on the world to take forth a message, to be a guiding presence,
mm-hmm.
That put responsibility on our shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of sitting around on the land
mm-hmm.
that was given to us, we've been turned loose on the world to try and inspire, give a little guidance.
You read my notes, Larry, because I was just going to say, don't necessarily mourn the past, but move forward. As you said, it started our task of being that light to the nations around the world. I couldn't have said any better, and I thank you for that. That's spot on. That's really, I think, what not necessarily that. So maybe this day is to focus on sadness that we have felt as a community. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we joined together here in Oahu at Temple, mourning the loss of life at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Maybe we need a day to focus on, the all too frequent, attacks and sad events that have befallen our Jewish community, both millennia ago and more recently. Maybe that's what this day is for. I think there's a place, as Roberta said, for including other groups of people, especially Black community, Hispanic community. But I think there's something to taking a day for the Jewish community and recalling those events and mourning them, or just focusing on sadness as a community. I think it's a healthy thing to do. And speaking of focusing on sadness, I wanted to close with a little bit of Echa of Keynote, the Book of Lamentations. And this is the final chapter, because in years past, our High Holy Day Choir, which sadly we're not going to be able to have this year at Temple, has opened our Rosh Hashanah service with this line. Actually, I want to go a little bit before, sorry. The joy of our heart has ceased, meaning the temple. Our dancing has turned into mourning. The crown of our head has fallen. Woe to us, for we have sinned. For this is our heart has become faint. For these things our eyes have grown dim. For Zion, which has become desolate. But you, O Lord, remain forever. Your throne endures throughout generations. Why do you forget us forever, forsake us so long? Remember, the exile to Babylonia was finite. The exile after, or what happened after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple is, there's no finite to that. But as Larry said, there's a light to that because we became a light to the nations around the world. So here's the line. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh amenu kikedem. Restore us to you, O Lord, that we may be restored. Let's seek the connection that our ancestors had in going to this spiritually powerful place known as the Beit HaMikdash, the temple that stood in Jerusalem, where it was said that one could come as close as one could possibly come to the divine presence. So that's the Book of Lamentations, but I didn't want to just speak the words. So we have a couple of minutes. I want to have you hear a little bit of the mournful chant that traditionally takes place on Tisha B'Av. I just want to give you a little taste of it. Get to where he starts. And notice the rabbi is sitting on the floor to do this.
Shoes. Then we sit either in the low bench or on the floor, and we read the book of Tisha. ישבה בדד, העיר רבת ים, הייתה כאלמנה, רבתי בגויים, צרתי במדינות, הייתה למס, בכותי בלילה, ודמעתה על לחיה, אין לה מנחם מכל אוהביה.
So that's a little taste of Echa, of the Book of Lamentations, and this mournful chant that goes on, chapter after chapter. I wanted to close tonight with two things, one short, one a little bit longer. The first is that if you've ever been to a Jewish funeral or Jewish house of mourning, traditionally one goes to a person in mourning and says the following: Hamakom yinachem etchem. May God grant comfort to you, b'toch sha'ar avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim, along with all those who mourn Zion and Jerusalem. And when we talk about those who mourn Zion and Jerusalem, we are talking indeed about those who continue to mourn the destruction of the first and second temples, and Jerusalem being our holy place, a city being laid to waste. So that's where that comes from, and we experienced that tonight. And then I found a modern interpretation of Echa, the Book of Lamentations. This is by Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt, she's in New York City, but she's writing in this time of COVID. And I wanted to close with these words for everybody. So again, you have to take into account that this is referring to not necessarily Hawaii, but I think there's some universality in this. So she writes, crying out, lonely sits the city once great with people. Her subways now empty, her classrooms closed. Refrigerator trucks await the bodies of the dead, wrapped in sheets of plastic and sacked like logs. Mourners keep a painful distance, unable to embrace. At testing sites, car lines up for hours before dawn, only to be turned away when swabs run out. At food pantries, cars line up for hours before dawn, creeping across asphalt until a stranger masked and gloved places a too small box of food in the trunk. And our children, the lucky ones, ache for their friends, forget what school felt like, cry for lost birthday parties and closed playgrounds. Some wake in the night from nightmares of the virus. a rising tide washing everyone away. Some die. We suffer anxiety attacks at the grocery store. Did someone breathe virus in the recirculated air? Things we've lost: touch, song, trust, safety, a year of childhood, if we're fortunate. Where are the seeds of hope on this darkest day? We stay at home to protect the vulnerable. We pace confined spaces, memorize every inch of wall. Our synagogues, our temples are shuttered. We are exiled to Zoom. We cry out from the depths, do you suffer with us, God? Who will we be when the pandemic is gone? So connecting the thought and feeling behind Tisha B'Av to what we're experiencing today and the tragedy of COVID-19. So with that, before we go our separate ways, I want to make sure that no one has a thought that is unspoken or a question unasked. So does anyone have any final thoughts they want to share on this Tisha B'Av evening of reflection and mourning or remembering sad experiences for our ancestors and for us in a sense? Anybody?
Hi, Rabbi Ken.
Please.
I just want to thank you for doing this program tonight. And I know we really appreciate it here on Kauai, and it's nice to see people from the Jewish community of Kauai here tonight. We mourn, we mourn many things, but we also have hope. And so it's both. It's mourning and it's also keeping hope. Mm-hmm. And these are, like you say, challenging times. So what you just read, challenging times. Mm-hmm. And who will we be when the pandemic is gone?
Yeah. I couldn't have said any better, Rabbi Rob, and I want to thank you and members of your community for joining with me and us tonight. And I think two things. I think you're quite right. We need to examine the conditions around these horrific events, including what we're experiencing now. And we need to learn from them and take that knowledge and that wisdom, more importantly, with us, that will make us better and stronger, as someone said earlier. So I think that's it. So unless anyone has any other thoughts, I want to thank all of you for making history with me tonight at Temple Emmanuel in Hawaii, for that matter, in a Reformed congregation to, of all things, talk about Tisha B'Av.
Yeah.
I hope that, sorry, any more comments? I do hope that you'll take time to focus on a bit the sadness that we share collectively as a community, or that we have. And most importantly, I hope that God will watch over you and that you will all stay well in this time that we're living through. So with that, thank you, everybody. And and thank you again for joining with me. And thank you. And look for Rabbi Rob in a couple of weeks on our Jewish Talk Story 2.0. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. And Shabbat Shalom when you say that now.
Shabbat Shalom.
Aloha.
I thought that's tomorrow.
That's right.